5 years. Help Wanted 1 has been out for 5 years. And yet, literally this week, somebody found something that no one has noticed yet. And it's something that became the best evidence we've ever had for MoltenMCI. But I hear you, right? Back up. What the hell is MoltenMCI and what does Help Wanted have to do with it? Well, that's what we're here to talk about today. So slices, put on your aprons, and let's bake ourselves a theory. First things first, what the hell is MoltenMCI? Briefly, it's a term that refers to the theory that Molten Freddy from Freddy Fazbear Pizzeria Simulator fully contains the souls of all of the victims of the missing child incident, or the MCI, hence the name MoltenMCI. Realistically, the only thing that MoltenMCI needs to prove to be true is that the FNAF 1 animatronics end up within the fun times. Everything after that is pretty much universally agreed upon. We see that by the end of Sister Location, the fun times shed their exoskeleton shells and form into one conglomerate mass of endoskeleton and wires, Ennard. As Ennard, it seems as though Elizabeth Afton is its primary soul. After all, it's the only voice that talks to us during the secret boss fight at the end of the game. And then, in the lead up to Pizzeria Simulator, we got some meta-text hints on the lore through the websites. Specifically, the Scott Games website and the FNAF World website, which seem to have a conversation with each other via the source code. I'll put the full conversation here, and I've talked about it at length before, but essentially it seems as though all the souls and Elizabeth Afton have formed into two separate sides. The souls within Ennard wanting to kick out Elizabeth Afton, or at least all the animatronics want to kick out Circus Baby, judging by the speech patterns like dummy and the way that the other one says we. The conversation resolves that the rest of Ennard is going to separate itself from Elizabeth Afton, and it's that splitting that we see the result of in Pizzeria Simulator. At the end of Sister Location, we have Ennard, but the beginning of Pizzeria Simulator, we have Scrap Baby and Molten Freddy. The idea being that Scrap Baby is Circus Baby after being ejected from Ennard and trying to remake herself. Like she said, she can put herself back together. And then Molten Freddy is whatever was left of Ennard after the cohesive unit of Elizabeth left. After all, if she was guiding and pretty much piloting Ennard, it seems as though she was the head honcho, or at least had the strongest willpower of the group. So that all is pretty direct and damn near confirmed. Where MoltenMCI comes into it is stating that after Elizabeth leaves Ennard, the rest of the souls that go into Molten Freddy are just the missing child incident victims, explaining why in the FNAF 6 Insanity ending, you get that shot of 6 gravestones, the missing child incident kids and Charlie, Elizabeth and Afton not being represented here. The question that MoltenMCI has to answer for this theory to work though is how did the missing child incident victims end up in the fun times? In Sister Location, we get a lot of talk about the scooper, and then we see it at the end when it kills Michael and allows Ennard to enter his body. In Sister Location, the scooper is primarily presented as something that can take the insides out of an animatronic and nothing else. But a blueprint you can find within Freddy Fazbear Pizzeria Simulator tells a different story. It's still able to inside out a motherfucker, but the primary function is Remnant injection. So, to catch folks up, we have to talk about Remnant. Remnant itself isn't necessarily a material, but rather the combination of material. The idea presented in the books is that when a spirit possesses a metallic object, most often in this franchise, an animatronic, and you melt down that metal in a very careful way, the resulting spirit stays within that liquid metal. This mercury-adjacent substance is what's referred to as Remnant. Said Remnant can be injected into other metallic objects, again, most often an animatronic, to then transfer the soul into the new vessel. The problem is that Remnant functions differently depending on when it's brought up in the games or books. Sometimes it's just seen as an energy source or battery, and other times it's literally seen as rehousing a spirit. Regardless, to my knowledge, we only get one direct reference to Remnant in the entire game franchise, and that's this blueprint of the scooper. And technically this blueprint of Molten Freddy, but I've heard online that it's actually in the code and not necessarily unlockable in-game. Regardless, at most two, definitely at least once. Essentially, the blueprints of the scooper tell us that the primary objective of this machine is to scoop out an endoskeleton, inject it with Remnant, and then leave it be, either then to be put back into the animatronic or just to study it. Notably, it mentions that while Remnant is heated, there's no notable activity or movement. It then further speculates that while heating Remnant Remnant may cause it to lie dormant, overheating it might neutralize its effects permanently. The thinking goes that this line is what inspires Henry to create the FNAF 6 pizzeria simulator. After all, the plan was to melt everything so much he would permanently neutralize the Remnant inside them. It's also theorized that this note on line B is how Michael survives at the end of Sister Location. If there was a trace amount of Remnant left on the scooper when it was used on Michael, this Remnant was probably scraped along his body. And while that might not necessarily cause him to be possessed, it might prompt the body to be able to be possessed by Michael. After all, it would leave metallic things for Michael to possess. Or it could also be leaning on one of the book explanations where Remnant is shown to in some way slowly heal whatever it is possessing. It's really unclear. The problem with Remnant is it's very muddy. It's one of those things that is used and referenced quite a lot in the books and sometimes in the games, but never once is it fully specified and explained. So it leaves its rules being somewhat interpretive and loosey-goosey. All this to say, if the scooper was in Sister Location and its primary function is to inject Remnant, has it already been used on the Funtimes? And if so, was that Remnant sourced from the missing child incident victims? This is the crux of the MoltenMCI theory. To be fair, there are a lot of good explanations for where this Remnant could come from outside of the missing child incident victims. After all, for example, the Sister Location Funtime animatronics are perfectly built to kidnap children, and they're sent on private parties all the time. So if there is Remnant in these animatronics, it could literally be the kids they kidnap at these parties. There's also the explanation that although the scooper was built, it was never used as a Remnant injector before William died. He just didn't get the time to do it. For MoltenMCI to work, William must have already collected the necessary pieces of the robots possessed by the missing child incident kids, melted them down into Remnant, and injected them into the Funtimes all before Sister Location happens. And just to make sure we're on the same page, when I say the animatronic the missing child incident kids are possessing, I mean the original Freddy's animatronics. Quick timeline recap. Freddy's opens, missing child incident happens, those kids get stuffed into the OG suits. The restaurant then later closes. Then the FNAF 2 location opens up with those withered original animatronics in the back. Then that closes. Then those original withered suits are refurbished and FNAF 1 happens. So I'm not saying the FNAF 1 animatronics were stuffed, but I'm saying those animatronics way back when were the ones that the missing child incident kids were possessing. Up until literally this week, we didn't have a lot of very strong evidence to suggest that the missing child incident kids were where the Remnant was sourced from. Granted, we did have some good evidence. For one, that grave shot I mentioned earlier is really solid evidence. Not to mention the parallels to the Silver Eyes is very solid evidence. But there wasn't really anything concrete within the game that really punched through a MoltenMCI theory. It was more a logical theory, something that made logical sense if a bit lacking in evidence. It's something that I myself believed and still believe, although I explained it in a modified sort of way. Full video over there if you want the explanation. And I mostly stand by that theory. But of course, all of this is before what I said literally was found this week. So let's finally talk about what was found in Help Wanted. On February 6, a founding by Maxley on Discord started making the rounds on Twitter. At the end of Entered Vent Repair, there's a scene a lot of us know well. We see a furnace, we turn it on, a fire starts, and we leave. That furnace has Sister Location robots scattered on top of it, but that makes sense. After all, Entered is the one that's attacking us here. There's always been this weird mess in the furnace, but at this distance it didn't look important, and nobody had thought to go and check before. Well, Maxley did, and found that it wasn't just some random mess, it was a pile of Endo 01 endoskeletons. In fact, someone else on Twitter ripped that model out and separated it into 4 distinct piles of Endo 01 parts. All this to say, we are shown a furnace at the basement of Sister Location filled with the parts of 4 different Endo 01 endoskeletons. Why is this notable? Endo 01s are the endoskeletons used within the original suits for Freddy, Bonnie, Chica, and Foxy. If anything was possessed from MoltenMCI, it would have been the Endo 01 endoskeletons. Help Wanted as a game was meant to clarify the lore moving forward. In my opinion, the main ethos of the game was that certain things from previous games might be slightly inaccurate, but whatever we present moving forward, trust that. And in that very same game, we are given the endoskeletons of FNAF 1 in a furnace in Sister Location, a furnace that would melt down those endoskeletons into Remnant. Now, before we go much further, I hear you. Right, there are 4 endoskeletons here, but the MCI had 5 victims. What's up? And that's a good point, but consider where the vengeful spirit ends up. The Golden Freddy suit. And the Golden Freddy suit has always had a weird relationship with endoskeletons. After all, it's a spring lock suit, so the endoskeleton would be fixed directly to the animatronic shell because it gets held back by the springs. And every time we've seen Golden Freddy presented, it's looked like it's an empty suit, or rather, it's in a wearable mode. So showing an endoskeleton for the 5th spirit of the MCI doesn't quite line up. This honestly is some of the strongest evidence I've ever seen for a theory in Five Nights at Freddy's. But of course, I would be irresponsible to not mention the problems with MoltenMCI even in lieu of this evidence. One of the major issues with MoltenMCI is timing. In FNAF 3, specifically the Follow Me minigames, we see where most likely William got the animatronic parts to melt down for sister location. After all, he leaves the FNAF 1 animatronics into a back room one by one and disassembles them when he gets there. The problem is the 5th minigame of this series shows William Afton dying in a back room. So logically, when you see this, it seems like the only time William got his hands on the animatronics to melt them down, he died, so he wouldn't have had time to turn them into Remnant and inject them. Now, there have been explanations for this situation. My personal one was my favorite, where the toys get involved. It's that video I talked about earlier. If you didn't watch the video, essentially, I argued that in FNAF 2, it's directly stated the withered animatronics are used for spare parts to repair the toys. So logically, I assumed that this was sort of a rudimentary attempt at Remnant injection. After all, if moving possessed metal from one metallic object to another can transfer that possession, wouldn't using spare parts from the withereds into the toys transfer some of that possession? Now, I'd never said it would go fully, and I explained this in here. Unfortunately, in Five Nights at Freddy's, there is a precedent for souls being split into 2 or more different versions of itself, especially when Remnant gets involved. So my thinking at the time was that at the end of FNAF 2, it said that the toys are going to be scrapped due to malfunctions, which would essentially leave them unguarded. William would be free to collect these thrown out animatronics, melt them down, and use them as Remnant for the fun times. But as we see, the fun times are very violent and erratic. They seem to be wild in their actions. So my explanation for this was that he took half of 5 souls, melted them into one material, and split them up into different animatronics. So the result was messy and animalistic. Then, thinking he needs more Remnant, he would go to get the original FNAF 1 animatronics. And then we see Follow Me where he dies. I still think this is a very solid theory, but the main problem is that in Help Wanted, it's Endo 01 endoskeletons, not Endo 02, which is what's in the toys, so it goes against the evidence we saw today. If Help Wanted is telling us that the Remnant injected into the fun times specifically came from the OG animatronics, what other explanation is there? I'm gonna be super transparent here. This explanation I've never been fond of. It's like valid and logical, I just think it goes against the presentation of the minigame of Follow Me. Personally. Regardless, another major explanation I've seen for MoltenMCI is that the Follow Me minigames do happen, they just don't all happen at the same time. Rather, it takes place over a stretch of time, where one by one, William Afton takes apart the FNAF 1 animatronics to use their metal for Remnant. And then there's some gap or time in between disassembling the last animatronic and going back. So the question is, why would he go back? Well, we do have an explanation for this in the book and movie. In both the Silver Eyes trilogy and the FNAF movie, it's implied that William is able to better control the spirits of the missing child incident when he's wearing the Spring Bonnie suit. And what do we see him going after in Night 5 of the Follow Me minigames? The Spring Bonnie suit. So the theory goes that William Afton would have gone to get the pieces of the FNAF 1 animatronics to melt them down for Remnant. However, when his experiments started being violent and erratic, he went back for the Spring Bonnie suit to try to combat this. But when he goes, he dies and is locked in the back room. This is a logical explanation, and I can't even say it's necessarily unlikely. The main reason I don't personally like it is, one, it seems weird to me that 4 of these minigames would happen close together and one would happen much later. And 2, it puts the souls in 2 different locations without a great explanation for it. If all of the Remnant is within the FNAF 1 animatronics and they've been taken to be melted down to Remnant, why are the spirits still here to trap and kill William Afton? Genuinely, why? That's my main holdup for this explanation. But to take a page out of my own book, Help Wanted, I believe, is telling us that the previous games in the franchise might not be 100% accurate. And this could be one of them. This could be Help Wanted telling us that, hey, Follow Me happened. William Afton did these things. But maybe not exactly as it was presented as we saw it in like, what, 2015? Before we do end though, I want to make one thing clear. In the title, I said, Help Wanted proves MoltenMCI. And I have to do that because, like, it's good clickbait, where I'm using a clickbaity, exaggerated title, but it is what the video is about, and I'm arguing for that. But I don't really think this proves that MoltenMCI is true. Very rarely, if I use proves, solves, debunks, or something like that in a title, do I legitimately mean that. I'm trying to say that it's a good argument for these things. I have to put it in the title because I gotta get you guys to click on it. That's just what the YouTube algorithm likes. Don't get me wrong, I think this is really, really solid evidence for MoltenMCI, but to use a word like proves or confirms or debunks, you really need solid evidence in this franchise. We honestly need to be a little bit more careful with the language we use in writing theories and talking about them. When you say something is proven, you have to be able to, without a doubt, make sure that it is true with evidence. Very little in this entire franchise would I say is proven. I'm not saying that just because I don't think this evidence proves something, I think it's bad evidence or even unlikely. I think this evidence makes MoltenMCI probably the most likely explanation for Ennard and Molten Freddy. But I just want to stress how few things in this franchise are fully confirmed. Not to tone police, obviously, who the fuck am I? Like, say what you want to say. But personally, in actual theories, I want to try to avoid words like confirm, debunk, prove, and the like. There are softer words I can use. Titles, though, they're not going to change. Anyway, this is an amazing piece of evidence that really makes the MoltenMCI theory super strong. And I'm living my best life because I already kind of believed in MoltenMCI. Sure, this would go against some of the details of my personal theory, but I can think about that for another day. In the meantime, if you got sick of me recapping all of this FNAF stuff and you need a little breather, why not go ahead and check out this Poppy Playtime video where I went over all the lore and plot in Chapter 3, as well as a mini timeline of everything up until that point. If you want your fan art showcased on the channel, make sure to use #RideTart. A huge shout out to the best channel members, the Dough Risers, and until next time, as always, stay toasty, slices.